Russia says it is terminating a year-long deal that allowed Ukraine to export its grain. The Kremlin says it will no longer guarantee safe passage in the Black Sea, where Ukraine had been moving critical grain supplies through Turkey's Bosphorus Strait and then to the open market. The UN has estimated that blocking Ukrainian grain could create food insecurity for as many as 47 million people. The White House just put out a statement saying they, too, believe that food insecurity will be heightened based on this decision. Our Scott McLean is with us now. This is an agreement that had been in place. It was actually this strange outcropping of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine for the last year. Now Russia says no more.
Yeah, exactly. And this wasn't entirely unexpected. There have been plenty of signs over the last few days and weeks that this was not going in a good direction. In fact, one Ukrainian diplomat said last month that she was 99% certain that the Russians were not going to renew this deal. And obviously that has turned out to be true. Still, you mentioned the White House reaction. There's plenty of reaction to this from the Western world. The EU calling it cynical, the Dutch foreign minister calling it utterly immoral. But from the Russian point of view, John, they think that, look, the UN was not living up to its end of the bargain. So in exchange for allowing Ukrainian grain to go through the Black Sea to market, it was supposed to get help from the United Nations in getting its own grain, its own fertilizer to market. Of course, there are no sanctions on Russian grain or on fertilizer, but of course there are plenty of sanctions on Russian banks. And so that has complicated the payment part of this. And so one of the key demands that the Russians had was access to those international payment mechanisms. What the UN had offered was access for the Russian Agricultural Bank. Obviously, that's been rejected. The UN says that it will continue to work to try to find a deal. They also acknowledge, though, according to one official, that the Russian position is pretty final. The Russians say that they will, though, go back to this deal if their conditions are actually met. And whether or not this has anything to do with the Kerch Bridge explosion, John, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, was asked about this earlier today, and he said this, and I quote, "These are absolutely unrelated events. Even before this terrorist attack, the position was declared by President Putin, and I repeat again, as soon as the part of the Black Sea agreements concerning Russia is fulfilled, Russia will immediately return to the implementation of the deal." We may also see some efforts by the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, to reach out to President Putin. He suggested that he may call. And of course, given that Ukraine is responsible for perhaps 10% of the world's grain markets, this is important, and it affects millions of people around the world, John.
Yeah, tens of millions. Scott McLean, thank you so much for that. Kate?
Joining us now for more on this, the CNN contributor Jill Doherty, adjunct professor at Georgetown University and former CNN Moscow bureau chief. It's good to see you, Jill. So Putin's been unhappy with this grain deal for some time. What do you see in this new move? How does it help Vladimir Putin?
In a way, it doesn't help him, obviously, because, you have a UN report coming out showing that 30% of the world population doesn't have access to enough food. So you would say that could hurt Russia. However, at the same time, Russia has really been romancing diplomatically a lot of the developing countries, especially in Africa, and saying, we are on your side. It's the big, rich countries that are not. So they're trying to insulate themselves. But this is a move that could backfire, and we'll have to see where it goes. But, this is all part of this war where in Ukraine, which is not just the military fighting, but all of these economic and other issues that really affect the entire world.
Yeah, I mean, because the impact of the decision, it really does go way beyond Ukraine. You were talking about kind of the estimates from the UN. I mean, the ripple effects of cutting off Ukraine's grain exports, it really is huge.
Oh, it is, because you have developing countries, primarily, let's say, Africa, Middle East, who really need this food. And eventually, maybe it will get out, but it's very difficult to ship it out, by rail or by land. So they're going to suffer. And then you have, this is the time that the harvest is beginning, in Ukraine. So that's another factor. Then you have around the world global warming and crops being hit. This is really very bad. Then for developing countries, wheat prices, grain prices can go up. So it could potentially hit everybody.
CNN's Claire Sebastian joins us from London. Clay, great to have you on. Look, Russia has been threatening to pull out of this deal. It basically expires in a few hours. So take us through the latest here, whether there's an anticipation of a last-minute agreement or whether it is done that Russia has officially pulled out.
Yeah, Eleni, Russia has been using this deal for leverage for really most of the year that it's been in force. It's been using it to its advantage in several ways. One, to try to get sanctions lifted. It says that it's still having trouble getting its own food and fertilizer onto global markets because of certain sanctions impacting its banks. There are no official sanctions on Russian food and fertilizer, it should be noted, but they've been trying to get certain financial sanctions lifted. The second thing is to try to show loyalty to certain developing, especially African countries with which Russia has been quietly cultivating alliances throughout this war by saying that the deal has not directed enough grain and foodstuffs to those countries that need it most. That's also part of what's going on here. As to whether this is actually a final decision, the language sounds pretty final right now. Russia says it's basically cancelled navigation guarantees, safe navigation guarantees through the Black Sea for ships carrying Ukrainian agricultural products. A UN official has told CNN that they believe right now Russia's words are final, but Russia has a lot to lose if it walks away here. It's got those, of course, alliances with developing countries. It's got its alliance, its partnership with Turkey, which helped broker this deal. President Erdogan has said that President Putin might even travel to Istanbul next month. And it has that leverage over potential lifting of sanctions. It was just in the last week or so that the UN and the EU floated the idea of reconnecting Russia's agricultural bank to the SWIFT international payments network under this deal. So really, this leverage is very important to Moscow. It remains to be seen whether they'll come back in, but Dmitry Peskov did say that if Russia feels that the concessions that it wants have been granted, it could reinstate the deal. So it's still possible.
Yeah. It's a really good point. I mean, what really struck me is the reality is that Russia, of course, has a lot of friends in a lot of emerging markets that rely on this grain. So it'll be interesting to see how he plays that. But look, I want to talk about wheat prices. They are higher today. We know they're off the highs that we saw at the start of the war. But how does this grain deal impact supply?
Yeah, so supply is one thing. Eleni, Ukraine, a major provider, about 10% of global wheat exports, 15% of corn. It accounts for pretty much half the world's market for sunflower oil. Some of that was also being exported under this deal. It's not just grain. And we did see wheat futures come up a little bit, just about 3% today, still down about 50% from their all-time highs hit last year when this conflict started. Corn futures up a little bit as well, so we're seeing a little bit of reaction there as well. But it is in terms of prices that this deal has had a major impact. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Administration, its own food price index, that has come down some 21% since between June 2022 and June 2023. If you're talking cereals in general, so grains, that's 24% drop, and then some 45% drop when you're talking about vegetable oil. So it has had a big impact on overall food prices. We could see a gradual reversal of that effect depending on how many hints we get from Moscow about whether this deal could be reinstated. And then, of course, don't forget that the World Food Programme gets half of its supplies for the developing world from Ukraine. There are countries in Africa like Eritrea and Somalia that have previously relied on Ukraine for pretty much all of their grain. So there is a lot riding on this deal. That is why so much effort was put behind it in the first place.
A lot at stake here. Clay Sebastian, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed on that.